Declaration of Independence began, the writing of the Declaration of Independence began on June 11, 1776, so just a bit more than 250 years ago. A 5-member committee was assigned to the task. You, of course, know that Thomas Jefferson is credited as the primary author. However, did you know that some claim him as a Unitarian? Later in life, in 1822, he wrote this to Unitarian Episcopalian Benjamin Waterhouse, and I quote, "I rejoice that in this blessed country of free inquiry and belief, the genuine doctrine of one only God is reviving, and I trust that there is not a young man today in the United States who will not die a Unitarian." So much for his abilities of prediction, nevertheless. Of course, there were other authors and signers of the Declaration. John Adams was one. He is even more directly associated with our faith, an enthusiastic Unitarian who completely rejected the idea of the Trinity. Another was Benjamin Franklin. In 1774, he attended the first formally established Unitarian church in England, the Essex Street Church in London. And there was Benjamin Rush, a deeply religious Enlightenment thinker and a Universalist. Finally, there was lawyer and judge Robert Treat King, a devout practitioner of Unitarian faith. All 5 signers are also prominently listed, of course, as founding fathers of this country. So today, on Father's Day, it's fitting to honor and offer gratitude for our fathers, all those who care for, guide, or protect us the way a nurturing parent would. Biological fathers, stepfathers, adoptive fathers, foster fathers, grandfathers, spiritual fathers, and just a couple of weeks before Independence Day, our founding fathers as well. The Reverend Dan Harper is the minister at First Parish in Cohasset, Massachusetts. I recently found a sermon of his titled "A Revolutionary Religion." Through it, I learned even more about the remarkable connection between the founding fathers of our country and the founding fathers of our faith. I'll start with Reverend William Emerson, whom we heard about earlier in the worship service. A staunch patriot, he joined the Massachusetts Minutemen at the first alarm on April 19, 1775, at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and was with them as they climbed the hill north of town to watch the British troops approaching. I'm guessing probably heard of one of his grandchildren, a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson. That grandchild grew up to become a Unitarian minister, although he did leave the ministry to become a public intellectual and founder of the Transcendentalist movement. Ralph Waldo Emerson was adamant about the then radical concept of the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, which is, of course, one of our 7 principles. Reverend Dan Harper also talks about the Reverend Dr. Samuel West, Unitarian minister of the church, which later became First Unitarian in New Bedford, Mass. He joined the fledgling American Army as a chaplain, and among other things, helped General Washington by deciphering a coded letter written by Benjamin Church, an American officer who was convicted of being a spy because of the letter's contents. Reverend John Murray, the father of Universalism, served as a chaplain in the Continental Army. George Washington appointed him to the Rhode Island Regiment in September of 1775. Dan Harper also talks about the commander of the Lexington militia, a man named John Parker, who commanded both black and white militiamen. On the same day that Reverend Emerson and the Minutemen were climbing up the hill near Concord, he famously said, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." While Parker did not live long enough to have the name Unitarian applied to his religion, succeeding generations of his family were well-known Unitarians. One grandson was the Reverend Theodore Parker, who became the Unitarian pastor of the largest church in the Boston area. Reverend Parker was an abolitionist who actively resisted the Fugitive Slave Act. He harbored runaway slaves and was said to keep a loaded pistol on his desk for emergencies. If you heard President Obama's speech given at the opening of his presidential center this past week, you may have heard him refer to the clergyman who said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That was written by Theodore Parker in an 1853 sermon. Many men of the Revolutionary era were connected to our faith, either directly or secondarily. But I have the feeling that if you asked them, they might have said that their faith in human agency and self-determination led them to be. Today, as we approach the 4th of July, I have to ask, what is a patriot today? And how do we celebrate 4th of July in the current environment? How do people of conscience commemorate the fathers of our country under the current circumstances? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government. These words, underscored by a list of 27 specific grievances against King George, represent the unanimous declaration that the 13 original colonies were no longer subject to British rule. It was signed by 56 representatives who knew that if the war did not succeed, their lives were on their line as traitors. It is truly an astonishing document, a genuinely radical statement. And yet, as revolutionary as it was and still is, I was amazed to learn that since it was written, over 100 countries have similar declarations of independence that have been based on our own across the planet. Each one has its own variations, but all of them are based on the original model. They include France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789. In 1804, the Haitian Declaration of Independence established Haiti as the first independent nation in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the world's first Black republic born from a successful slave rebellion. Many were adopted in Latin America in the early 1800s. Vietnam produced its version in 1945, and Kosovo in 2008, which is all well and good. However, the Declaration can also be used as a codification by a group of propertied white men of America's original sin. The document states that all men are created equal and have unalienable rights. Yet it said nothing about slavery. Many of the signers were, of course, slaveholders themselves or profited from the slave labor-dependent cotton industry. In an Independence Day speech in 1850, Frederick Douglass eviscerated the hypocrisy of the holiday. He said that the 4th of July highlights gross injustices and cruelty and the continuing victimization of enslaved Black Americans. The Khan Academy notes that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously described the Declaration as a promissory note. Dr. King argued that during his 1963 March on Washington speech, that America had defaulted on this note by issuing Black citizens a bad check that came back marked insufficient funds. In an article titled The Paradox of the Declaration of Independence, the Aspen Institute pointed out that it took 87 years after the signing of the Declaration and a bloody Civil War for African Americans to gain their unalienable rights. And then it required another 100 years of courageous protests and sacrifice before those rights could be exercised by most Black Americans. Of course, that wasn't our founding fathers' only failing. It was with intentional irony that the women's suffrage movement and the second wave women's rights movements used the Declaration in their fight for their own unalienable rights. According to the National Women's History Alliance, first wave feminists utilized the Declaration to frame their fight as the natural, unfinished business of the American Revolution. And then at the first Women's Rights Convention in the United States in 1848, Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton used the Declaration of Independence as the literal framework for what was called the Declaration of Sentiments. She altered the famous preamble to state, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal," and demanded that women be granted immediate citizenship and voting rights. Virtually every movement for human liberation in this country has referred to the Declaration on the basis of as the basis of their demand. The disability movement, Asian Americans fighting the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, Latino and Latina Americans, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, referring to the Declaration's right to revolution and self-determination, to protest against exploitation. Also ignored were the horrific injustices, the intentional and unapologetic victimization of this continent's indigenous people. Contrasting all that with the promises of the Declaration can be almost excruciatingly painful. And today, in the midst of Pride Month, it's important to note that according to the Museum of the American Revolution, back in the 1960s, early LGBTQ+ rights organizations often staged peaceful protests at Independence Hall in Philadelphia on the 4th of July, protesting the exact birthplace of the Declaration. Activists demanded that all citizens, regardless of sexual orientation, be granted their unalienable rights. Again, aiming to hold America accountable to its founding promise. Then there's the Declaration of Transgender Independence that states in part, regardless of gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation, all people are created equal and that they have been endowed by their Creator, and etc. You know, when I was growing up and as a young adult, I believed in the viability of that promise. I assumed that what Frederick Douglass called the hypocrisy of the holiday was gradually but inevitably being undone, that we were inexorably moving for justice for all. Yet today, as we approach the 250th anniversary of that declaration, our rights, even our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms, are being actively undermined. In some cases, directly attacked by our own government. Mother Jones magazine recently published an article comparing the 27 colonial grievances against our current government's ongoing actions. I won't exhaust you or depress you with listing all 27, but here's just one, as written in the Declaration. King George has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. In other words, the king was refusing to approve laws legally passed by the colonies. The current administration hasn't so much refused to approve many laws as it has to simply ignore them or directly violate them. A number of laws being flouted is truly breathtaking. Those governing privacy and data, the War Powers Resolution, the legally impounding for congressionally approved funding, claiming powers not afforded the president, the ongoing effort to end birthright citizenship, a right enshrined in the Constitution. Unfortunately, there are too many others to name. So what is patriotism in this era? Robert Reich says that patriotism isn't about building walls, punishing immigrants, cutting taxes for the rich, attacking the press, or dividing us by race and faith. True patriots don't pander to divisiveness or hate. They work to confirm the we in we the people of the United States. We the people, of course, is not the Declaration. Those are the famous opening words of the Constitution. But both documents celebrate the far-reaching ideas of the Enlightenment. The visionary concepts behind the founding of our nation were all based on Enlightenment ideas and ideals, especially those of John Locke. They championed the inherent worth of the individual, the equality of all people, the belief in the democratic process, and the insistence that people have the right to determine their own truth and their own destinies. So today, 250 years after the world-altering fight for freedom began, today when we find ourselves straining under the yoke of a new version of oppression, how can we commemorate and even celebrate these ideals? The first, of course, is to continue the fight for the expansion of human rights, all listed above. And then there's Heather Cox Richardson, suggests a way, another way. She said that we should tell each other stories of friends and relatives who have built this country and contributed to its success. So I'll tell you a story of my own father, who built ships during World War II in Camden, New Jersey, at one of the most productive shipyards in the United States during the war. It specialized in heavy combat ships, completing 26 major vessels between 1941 and 1945. After the war, He worked on the construction of the Delaware Memorial Bridge, a vital East Coast artery, and a memorial to World War II fallen soldiers that spans the Delaware. What stories would Another way would be to honor the land that we walk on and occupy, the land that we stole from the people of this continent, and find a way to hold it sacred. Not only by acknowledging our debt as we do at the beginning of our services each week, and by restoring habitat in our native plant garden, but by supporting Indigenous-led restitution efforts. For example, did you know that in California, you can pay a voluntary land acknowledgement fee to help return Indigenous land to Indigenous people? An example is the Shumai land tax, which is helping people in the Bay Area. Or we can support tribal-led bison restoration and management through charitable donations. Then there's the Land Back movement, a group called the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative defines the Land Back movement this way. Land Back encourages settlers to work to repair the harm colonialism has done and continues to inflict on Indigenous people by returning control over ancestral territories back to its stewards, allowing them to begin restoring their connection to ancestral lands in meaningful ways by transferring power and wealth back to Indigenous people. Land restitution, which includes water, natural resources, and infrastructure on the land, supports Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, environmental sustainability, and economic justice. And we can take steps to demonstrate our right to throw off oppressive rule, ones that remind our government that it derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. These are not only actions that are consistent with our historic patriot roots and the ideals of equality, freedom, and democracy, they are central to the principles of Unitarian Universalism that all of us here do our best to live by. So this year, on 4th of July, as you enjoy your barbecue, tell your family stories, organize your neighborhood, and take up a collection for Indigenous land restoration or sponsor a baby bison. So may it be.